on in, everybody. We're going to get started. So if we could just flick to the next slide. So we just wanted to start with an acknowledgement of country. So in the spirit of reconciliation, Nelson Sengage acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. And if we just go to the next one. So this webinar is being recorded and the recording will be sent out to everyone who's registered at the beginning of next week. So if there's anything you'd like to catch up on and if you want to share this with colleagues, you can. We've got both the Q&A and the chat open. So if you've got any questions, feel free to pop them in either of those as we go. And if we do run out of time, one of our team members will be in touch with an answer. And then there's 2 emails on the screen there. So if you've got any questions that come up after this webinar, you'll be able to reach out to the team at Nelson Primary or to Amanda directly. Thank you, everyone.
And hello, and my name is Kate McGough, and thank you for attending today's webinar. We're so excited, and we're really excited to have Amanda join us. Amanda Sutera is an instructional literacy coach and literacy consultant, and she's worked with school leaders and with classroom teachers in years 5 to 9. Amanda has taught in schools for over 14 years, having been a lower primary and upper primary classroom teacher, as well as a school leader in independent and Catholic schools across Melbourne. Amanda founded Hands on Heads Literacy Consulting to provide side-by-side support for classroom teachers in their classrooms through instructional coaching. She collaborates with teachers to build their literacy capacity, strengthen their literacy practice, and impact student literacy achievement and engagement. And Amanda grounds all of her work in evidence. She draws on research and she's informed by practice. So over to you, Amanda.
Thank you so much, Kate, for that introduction. Well, hi, everybody. I'm grateful for the opportunity to share my knowledge this afternoon with the wider education community on this webinar. And I thank you for joining, whether it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon for this live session, or perhaps it's a little earlier, a little later, or you may be watching the recording. You're here because you want to make a difference to your students and to their education. And perhaps you're here as a school leader, observing, watching, learning to support your teams. I've put this photo on the screen. This is a photo from one of my year 5-6 classrooms. And this photo is here because this is where the moments of magic happen. They happen in the classroom. They're those moments of joy that happen in the classroom. They're moments of tears that happen in the classroom. There's moments of magic, as I like to say, and they're those little aha moments. But every single day, those moments are taking place inside of classrooms all over the world. And it's here where I first began to restructure my literacy block almost 10 years ago now, having moved from year 2 and jumping all the way up to a 5-6 classroom. So that's what we're doing here today for you. We're here to provide you with information about how to restructure your literacy block so that you can continue making moments of magic in years 3 to 6. So as a little warm-up, I guess, or an icebreaker for us, just pop in the chat, would you rather teach a class where students debate passionately and they go off topic often, or would you prefer to have a class where the students stay on task but they contribute minimally? So if you can just pop an A or B. So this session is for you, and you're in the right place if you are a 3 to 6 classroom teacher or a school leader. And I also acknowledge that there would be some people who are joining us and watching this who perhaps might be in younger levels and are wanting to know, well, what happens after decodables? So there may even be some year 2 teachers or leaders with us as well. You're here because you're looking for the next steps after decodables, and you want to invest in your own literacy practice so that you can invest in your students' learning and support them. And you're in the right session if you're wanting to restructure your literacy block to include explicit teaching of literacy, language, and literature skills. You're ready to take action to build your literacy capacity, and if you're a leader, to support your teams in doing exactly that. Just like we would if we were in the classroom, we'd have learning intentions and success criteria. And I acknowledge that in some contexts, these might be co-constructed, or perhaps during the sessions, there may be an essential question, a guiding question, or an enduring understanding. But for our purposes today, we are learning to restructure the literacy block to explicitly and effectively teach literacy, language, and literature skills. And to be successful in this today, we can identify the fundamental elements of an effective mid to upper primary literacy block. And we can use resources to develop depth and rigor in language comprehension and writing craft. Our session looks like this. I'll present you with a case study. We'll draw on evidence, research, and frameworks, and then we'll explore and unpack those fundamental elements of a 3 to 6 literacy block. Whenever there's change that takes place in any context, the greatest challenges come with making some. Whenever there's change that takes place, there's often challenges and there's often opportunities. So when we're thinking about restructuring the literacy block and what happens after decodables, we may be faced with 1, 2, or 3 of these challenges. There may be a lack of shared beliefs and understandings, which can result in inconsistent literacy practices and an unclear direction. That might look like nodding and smiling in planning sessions, but perhaps going back to classrooms and doing our own thing and closing the door. It might look like teachers doing different things in their classrooms when they're in the same year level, or perhaps one year level's doing one thing and a different year level's doing something else, but there wasn't that clarity or that shared belief and understanding that really underpins that work that we do in classrooms to work towards a consistent goal. Another challenge you may be facing at the moment is that lack of, that uncertainty or confusion about, well, what happens after students have mastered that word recognition? What happens? What are those next steps once students become proficient readers and they master that word recognition? And another challenge you may be facing as you start to restructure the literacy block, that alignment between reading and writing instruction, where it might still be in isolation, but you want it working together. You want that alignment between reading and writing in years 3 to 6. And as I said, for every challenge, there's an opportunity. So we might think of these 3 opportunities as goals or objectives, things we want to achieve as we work towards success in restructuring the literacy block. We want to ensure a collective clarity about direction and approaches, ensuring that there is that consistency and coherence in these 3 to 6 practices. There's a goal and we're all working towards achieving that common goal for however that looks for your context. There's certainty and direction. We know what we're doing after students have mastered word recognition. And finally, one of the opportunities we really want to achieve is that alignment between reading and writing instruction in the literacy block with that use of quality mentor text. If you're a school leader watching this, here's a coaching tip, the very first thing for you to focus on, the first opportunity would be to have that collective clarity and that very clear direction around where we're going, why we're going, and how we're going to get there. I present you now with a case study. So here's a group of teachers and school leaders, and I've been working with this group of teachers for the past 2 years. So they began to restructure their literacy block at the beginning of 2024. And I was brought in to support them in doing that, restructuring their literacy block, but also to help them build their literacy capacity and their knowledge of literacy strategies, of instructional practices, and of routines. A bit of a before and after to show you the difference between where they've come from and now where they currently are almost 2 years later. So at the very beginning when I met these teachers, their reading and writing instruction was taught in isolation. There was a reading block and there was a writing block, and it was quite separate and there was no real sort of alignment between the two. There was a minimal use of quality mentor texts to explore literacy, literature, and language skills. So mentor texts were being used, but not to the most effective or best way possible. The teaching, of course, was explicit. Explicit teaching, explicit instruction was apparent. It just wasn't as intentional, phased, or as cumulative as it needed to be for that literacy block to have that structured approach. And probably the biggest thing of all, their knowledge, their use of skills and concepts in the classroom around comprehension were really solely based on comprehension strategies and whether or not students could read and respond and answer questions about what they had read. So teachers were invited to do, and I used to think and now I think, around using quality mentor text to support the students in making meaning of what they had read and what their literacy block looked like. So as we started to restructure the literacy block and bring a structured approach, we saw significant changes to what the teachers were doing, but also to the students' learning. And we're still seeing significant changes and the impact of restructuring that literacy block right up until today. So the teacher's knowledge has developed and has built a capacity, and there's been a positive impact on student learning, but also on student engagement. So now what we're seeing with this restructure of a literacy block is that the reading and writing instruction is now taught at the same time. So there may be that quality mentor text that's being used. And so with that quality mentor text, there's explicit teaching around literacy, language, and literature skills. In the one block, students are now learning about reading and writing about reading, and they're also being able to think like readers and think like writers as they unpack and explore quality mentor texts. Mentor texts can be novel study texts, literature study texts, it could be nonfiction texts. And here we have an example of a quality mentor text from the Nelson Novastar series, and this is a nonfiction text. The other thing we've started to see is that the teaching has become more explicit. It's intentional, it's phased, and it's cumulative. So the teachers are now drawing on the gradual release of responsibility. They're now able to identify which phase of that gradual release of responsibility they're in. What do those instructional practices look like? What literacy strategies am I using during that time? It's cumulative. They're building on previous concepts and previous skills to increase the complexity of what's being taught. We can see here that this Novastar example from one of the lesson plans from a nonfiction text also includes that phased gradual release of responsibility through the use of subheadings and the instructional routine, intentional instruction, scaffolded instruction, and purposeful practice. And probably the biggest shift and one of the most important shifts is that comprehension is now based on vocabulary, background knowledge, fluency, as well as the comprehension strategies and being able to read and respond to questions about a text. So the teachers have introduced over the past 2 years how to explicitly teach Tier 2 vocabulary and sometimes Tier 3 vocabulary prior to reading. Background knowledge has become an important part of the restructure of their literacy block. And fluency practice has also become an important part of their literacy block. What we're starting to see and what the teachers have done essentially is introduce the big 5 of reading or the big 6 of reading, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Here we can see the intentional use of vocabulary explicitly being taught to students through the use of a mentor text. And here this is a word wall from a classroom. And in the Novastar series, we can also see the explicit teaching of vocabulary that has already been selected, Tier 2 words and Tier 3 words. Here we can see a practical example from the classroom. We were modeling ways for students to provide feedback to their partners for their fluency feedback. And it was based on accuracy, expression, and fluency, the feedback being specific and the feedback being helpful for their partner for future reading goals. So if we think back to those opportunities we were talking about earlier on in the session, we're looking for 3 goals of restructuring the literacy block. So what we can see here with these after elements is that there's been collective clarity. The teachers now have a shared belief and understanding. There's direction and certainty about, well, knowing what to do after decodables and how to do that after the students have become proficient decoders. And finally, what this after also shows us is that there's now an alignment between reading and writing instruction using quality mentor text to explicitly teach the literacy, literature, and language skills. We'll have a look at some theoretical frameworks and evidence-informed models before we then go on to have a look at some practical examples in context. So as well as the evidence and the research, we're guided by the what to teach based on our curriculum. I'm aware that we've got people viewing from other countries, from other states. And so here, this is an example of the English curriculum. And here are the 3 strands from the Australian curriculum: language, literature, and literacy. Where I'm from in Victoria, we commonly use the Victorian curriculum. And we can see that that also includes the 3 strands as well. I did mention before what we started to see with the restructure of that 5-6 literacy block was components of the big 5 or the big 6 of reading. So research indicates that there are 5 or 6 essential components of knowledge and skills for students to incorporate, for reading to be incorporated in a high quality and effective literacy block. Phonemic awareness, the ability to hear, identify, and manipulate spoken words. Phonics, the relationship between letters and sounds in written language. Fluency, the ability to read text accurately, quickly, and with proper expression. Vocabulary, the understanding of word meanings, including spoken and written words. And reading comprehension, which is the ability to make sense and gain meaning from what has been read. Now, this is from the National Reading Panel. Konza also introduces us to this idea of oral language as being part of the big 6. So when we're thinking about this restructure of the literacy block after decodables, we're also still using the phonemic awareness and phonics in our literacy block, but we have more of a focus around fluency, vocab, comprehension, and oral language. So again, if you are a leader watching the webinar and you're not sure where to start with the restructure or supporting your teams to restructure their literacy block, focus on one. And a great place to start would be focusing on the goal of fluency, introducing that to the restructured literacy block. So Konza suggests oral language as one of her ideas of the big 6. She highlights oral language underpins all aspects of literacy and is essential for vocabulary development, phonemic awareness, and reading comprehension. As with the group of teachers I introduced you to earlier, as they restructured their literacy block, they started to bring in some frameworks and evidence and research. And none other than Scarborough's reading rope is quite evident in their literacy block, which is an evidence-informed framework. I acknowledge that there are other types of frameworks: the simple view of reading, Duke and Cartwright's active view of reading, Luke and Freebody's 4-resource model, and there are others. For the purpose of our session today, we're keeping it simple, not that this is a simple framework by any means, but we're just honing in on this particular framework for our session. As students master word recognition and increase their automaticity of reading words, we start to draw our attention up here in the 3 to 6 literacy block around language comprehension. So word recognition in years 3 to 6 is not as prevalent, although what we continue to do is build that fluency through word recognition. These elements from Scarborough's reading rope play out in the classroom, and they're evident in the 3 to 6 literacy block, especially that one I introduced you to earlier. So background knowledge is looking at concepts and facts, but also to do with perhaps text types, text structures. Background knowledge, and I'll show you in a moment, can also be non-written. It might be audio or visual. And it's a way to engage students with new information to build their knowledge around what they're going to read. Vocabulary, we're thinking about the depth and breadth. So how many words do students know and how well do they know the words? Can they use precision and sophistication in their writing? And can they understand the meaning of precise and sophisticated words in their reading? Language structure is looking at the syntax and the semantics, those grammatical features. How well do we understand how words are put together in a sentence, and how well can we make meaning of some of those words, phrases, and sentences? Verbal reasoning is looking at that skill of inference, drawing clues from one area of the text to the other and across and in between. And verbal reasoning also includes literary devices and figurative language, inferring what those are in text and how to use them as writers. And finally, literacy knowledge. So print concepts, being aware that texts go from left to right, perhaps that there are spaces between words, understanding that different text types and genres have different visual features, such as fiction and non-fiction text having different visual features. And conventions of text. Sometimes a picture story book looks really different to an informative type text. Just as there are many reading frameworks, there are also many writing frameworks. And for the purpose of our session today, keeping it simple, again, not that this framework by any means, the writing rope by Joan Sedita, is simple, but for our webinar today, we will focus on this. So I'm using this model. And as we saw in the reading rope, that if students are weaving together all of these skills and ability to use these skills as writers, then they become proficient and skilled writers. So if we have a look at critical thinking, this is where the content knowledge comes in, the background knowledge, the understanding. This is where students start to generate their ideas, how important it is for them as writers to process ideas. And this is where the oral language that Konza talks about comes in as well, having students discuss and talk about their ideas prior to writing. This critical thinking part of the writing rope is also part of that writing process. Organizing, drafting, writing, editing, revising, and publishing. The syntax element of the writing rope is around that grammar, that syntactic awareness, where words, phrases, and sentences make sense. This is about grammar, sentence structures, word structures, about word level, sentence level writing. When we think about text structure, that's looking at the types of text that are there and the way that they are composed, the ways that they are composed. Looking at paragraph structure, the outline of paragraphs and how they've been put together and how to write paragraphs using different types of approaches and structures. The writing craft is unpacking and having students write about Tier 2 vocab, including that type of vocabulary, as well as Tier 3 vocabulary. That inclusion of precision, the precision of words, the sophistication of words, and the purpose of words used. With this writing craft, the literary devices also includes things like figurative language, the mood and tone of words that students choose to use, and that perspective or the point of view. And finally, on the writing rope, we see this transcription, indicating spelling, that inclusion of morphology and etymology, the keyboarding and handwriting skills for automaticity, and being able to put words on the page. So here there are similarities between the reading and the writing rope, and you can understand now why I've just honed in on these two for the purposes of this session. The more that we can interpret from these reading and writing frameworks, the more we start to identify commonalities and traits between them and across them to inform our literacy practice. This essentially underpins, this theoretical framework is underpinning what we then will do as practice in restructuring the literacy block. What we start to see is there are common elements across Scarborough's reading rope and Sedita's writing rope. Some of those elements include how the language structure and syntax is aligning. We can see critical thinking and literacy knowledge. Vocabulary is evident on Scarborough's reading rope and is also included in Sedita's writing rope as part of the writing craft. Verbal reasoning, writing craft, and then literacy knowledge with writing craft. So far in our session, we have explored the case study, which we'll come back to, evidence, research, and frameworks. And what we're now going to dive into is the fundamental elements of the 3 to 6 literacy block. So looking at this from more of a practical hands-on lens with some clear examples for you to see what it's been like in the classroom. One of the most important things, first and foremost, as we restructure the literacy block, is to have a quality mentor text. They are going to form the backbone of reading, writing, speaking, and listening. They should link to a topic where possible that students are already learning about, perhaps in another subject area, maybe in a unit of inquiry, or maybe as a knowledge-rich curriculum. Quality mentor text can be a novel. They can also be a picture storybook. They might also be a non-fiction text, depending on the purpose. Mentor texts in a classroom bridge that gap between reading and writing, making it easier for students to connect those essential literacy, literature, and language skills in the classroom. The mentor texts during reading help students to make sense of what they're reading about, but it also, as we saw from some of those frameworks, helps them to bring in their knowledge and understanding of literacy concepts, as well as being able to replicate that when they write their own texts. For students to use mentor texts and quality texts, they see that these texts are the success. This is what we want students to be writing about, to be replicating. And so they're looking for things like word choices in those mentor texts. They're looking at how sentences have been composed. They're looking perhaps at how the paragraph has been structured. So they're reading about that as readers and they're writing about that as writers. It can be very easy when we restructure the literacy block for us to think that we have to get through the text when we're reading, but we're not. We're not rushing through it either. We're not changing text every week. We're really thinking about the purpose and the intention of why we're using this quality mentor text for the students. And we're not reading it to get through it. We're reading it to explicitly teach those literacy, language, and literature skills. And we're connecting the reading, writing, speaking, and listening. When we think about selecting quality mentor texts, how do we know what to choose? Well, here's an example of some of the non-fiction and fiction texts from the Novastar series. But we can also select text based on reading spines, so Pi Corbett's work or perhaps Lemov's reading plagues. Don't forget that students in years 3 to 6 are starting to work towards independently and collaboratively reading. So ensure that there's opportunities there for students to independently read where possible, whether that might be their own text or perhaps rereading of a class text, and an opportunity for students when restructuring that literacy block to collaboratively read. Another crucial part of restructuring the literacy block is that component of background knowledge. This prepares students for what they're going to read, what this whole class text that they're reading about is going to be about, what they're viewing. So when we build background knowledge, we consider the purpose. What part of the knowledge are we building for the students? Is it content? Is it information to do with the way that the text is presented? How is the background knowledge going to support the students about text structures or language features? I mentioned this a little earlier, but background knowledge can also include things like maps and diagrams. So here we have this from the Novastar series. There's a background knowledge text to do with the islands of the Galapagos. It can also be videos to immerse them. It could be front-loading them with vocabulary, which is separate to explicitly teaching particular words to do with the text. It could be visual, as I said. It could even be audio. They might listen to a piece of text or they might just analyze something visual. This example, students were reading a text about rainforests. We provided them with a glossary list and went through that in the classroom. And then we also watched a video about rainforests before they went in and read the text. So that was also another example of how, when we restructure the literacy block, we're bringing in background knowledge before we dive into the text, as well as vocab. Now we're starting to see how some of the research and evidence is being brought in a practical way. One of the big 5 of reading, or big 6, was that notion of fluency. So fluency shows us the fluency practice, the ways that students can fluently read a text. It's a strong indicator of their ability to make sense and make meaning of what they've read. It really supports the comprehension. Fluency practice can include modeled fluent reading by the teacher or perhaps another adult in the room. And it can be a repeated reading of text, something that students have already seen. It might be wide reading, it might be close reading. It could be a text that students select and read independently or collaboratively. When we think about passages to provide students with, it could be from the whole class novel study or literature study, the mentor text, or it could be even a non-fiction extract or a text connected to other subject areas. Usually, the ideal time when we're thinking about paired reading for students is 10 minutes, and that provides them the opportunity to improve their accuracy, expression, prosody, and fluency. Here we've got an example of students providing each other with feedback. Okay, they're sharing something that they've done well and something to work towards. You can see the feedback is quite specific and helpful. And in the inside front covers of the Novastar series, there are also suggested fluency passages for you to read with your students or to your students. Based on the work from Beck and her colleagues is that notion of tiered vocabulary. So tier 2 words are the words that we are explicitly teaching to students before they are encountered during the text. If we're implicitly teaching the words, they're the words that we're reading, they're the words we're explaining to the students as we encounter them. What we're thinking about with this is we're explicitly teaching these words to students for sophistication and precision. And again, vocabulary is one of those big 5 that supports students to make meaning of texts. We've got a Freya model here that was introduced to the students and modeled using the word desecrate. One of the most important parts when we're unpacking vocabulary is around the explanation and the parts of the word to support that morphological awareness. When we're modeling explicitly taught vocabulary, we're thinking about using routines such as examples or non-examples, fiction, non-fiction, a close perhaps, a sentence expansion, or a word relationship activity. As students become more familiar, confident, and capable with articulating sounds, so the word recognition, we then think about that morphological awareness, the prefixes and the suffixes, which I'll come to in a moment. Beck and her colleagues suggest that it's estimated that students can be taught explicitly 400 words over the school year. So I did some maths. If we've got 40 weeks in a school year, imagining that there's 10 weeks for every 4 terms. If we do 400 divided by the 40 weeks, that's 10 words a week. So about 2 words per lesson, maybe even 3, to explicitly teach the students the vocabulary they need to access the text. Again, in the Novastar series, we can see that some of those words have already been chosen and selected. We've got tier 2 words and tier 3 words. Another part of the fundamental elements when we're restructuring the literacy block is to include the grammar, syntax, and punctuation, and the teaching of the word level, the sentence level, and that paragraph level writing. It's here when we start to look at things like bringing in sentence combining, sentence stems, and sentence expansion. That's why it's so important to have a quality mentor text, the novel study, the literature study, so that students can see and read how the author's done that in the text and then replicate that for themselves when they're analysing, after analysing, to write themselves in their own texts. We think about introducing students and explicitly teaching them parts of speech, types of sentences, the sentence structure, simple, compound, complex, compound, complex. This is where those transitional words come in that we saw from both the reading ropes. So that students can be supported when they're constructing paragraphs or multiple paragraphs. So grammar and syntax play a part when we are deconstructing or constructing a particular text type or genre. And sometimes particular text types and genres will have a particular grammatical or syntactical focus. Here we can see on this anchor chart that an adverbial phrase was being used to begin sentences. And over here we can see that there's a sentence level focus on the inside front cover of each of the Novastar series. During this restructuring of the literacy block, we want students to be working through the process of writing just as they're completing text and having a focus on word level writing, sentence level, paragraph level, and text level writing. We provide students in the literacy block, this restructured literacy block, to think about those ideas, the generation of ideas. How are they thinking about what they're going to write about? And this is where that oral language again comes into play. We also want students, that was from a Year 4 classroom. This example here is from a Year 6 classroom. So after the students have had an opportunity to draft, write, we now introduced them to this revising and editing checklist that we constructed for their analytical essay. And here we've got text structures and language features. So this is part of that editing and revising phase. As students move into the middle and upper primary school, the types of reading, types of text that they come across and what they're reading become increasingly complex. Students in mid to upper primary should be able to read, write, and spell many everyday words, and they're those tier 1 words if we're thinking about Beck and her colleagues' framework, along with words of increasing length and phonological complexity. So as they move up, we're moving beyond that. When we get to years 3 to 6, we're really focusing on those multisyllabic words, teaching students to spell words not only based on the phonemes and what they can hear, but also based on the syllables of the word. We ensure that morphology instruction is included in years 3 to 6, okay? The prefixes, the explicit teaching of suffixes, base words, and bringing in etymology as well. Morphological awareness impacts the student's ability to make meaning of text, and it supports their reading comprehension. Here we can see in this example from the Nova Star series, the inside front covers each have a morphological awareness relating to the text and the text type. This example here is based on the word prank, and we can see that this is a word family routine where the word ending of these words, so the suffixes, are changing to vary the word type. In a years 3 to 6 literacy block, we ensure that handwriting and keyboarding is included, that there's practice, opportunities for students to practice the automaticity of this. We want them to be fluent handwriters and fluent typers. Keyboarding, we provide times for students to practice their skills. That includes placing hands and fingers correctly on a laptop. If we're thinking about students from years 2 moving to years 3, or perhaps year 4 moving to year 5, in some contexts, they may not have had an opportunity yet to work with a device. So we need to teach them where to place their hands, where to place their fingers on the keyboard, and even doing some wrist exercises, just like we would for handwriting, to prepare for typing. With handwriting, we're still explicitly modeling the handwriting to students and giving them time to practice joining of letters, including letters such as diagonals, so that they can write legibly and fluently. A key component when we restructure the literacy block is that inclusion of assessment, whether that's something more formative, so something like an example or a non-example when we're checking for understanding, so that we can track student progress and check gaps to inform our next steps, or if it's something more formal in terms of a summative assessment task. We still include opportunities for assessment in a restructure of the literacy block. And we always come back to the purpose. What is it that we're assessing and why? And what are we going to do with this information now that we've assessed the students' reading, writing, speaking, and listening skills? During the years 3 to 6 literacy block, there needs to be an opportunity for the teacher to be reading in front of the students and for the students to practice reading on their own, whether that's independently or with a partner or in a group, as well as an opportunity for the teacher to be modeling writing, whether that's co-constructing writing or deconstructing writing, as well as students having that opportunity to write independently or as a group or with a pair. This is where we use the think aloud routines. This is where we bring in reading routines and writing routines. So during the literacy block, we might start to see things like a choral read or an echo read as we restructure this literacy block. There'll be opportunities for students to use the routine stop and jot perhaps, or read, write and discuss. We also ensure that in a restructured literacy block, students have the opportunity to practice paired reading with their partner. We give them an opportunity to read independently, whether that's a teacher-selected text or an independently selected text. If we are giving students that opportunity to read independently, we give them purpose and we give them an intention, and there has to be accountability. And that's where we might use something like AIR, accountable independent reading, where they have a text-dependent question to think about as they're reading, so that at the end of that reading time, they have something to respond to. Or it might be during AIR, it might be during a whole class read aloud through that quality mentor text that we give them a questioning the author type question from Beck and her colleagues. This is where students might even respond to what they've read. They might write something to do with a sentence level or within a paragraph level focus. It's here where reading improves writing and writing improves reading. And finally, retrieval practice is a strategy of having students to actively recall what they've learned previously. So it's through retrieval practices where we want students to access their learning and transfer it to a new context. In this restructured literacy block, this is where we might see something like a daily review. And it's that opportunity for them to retrieve and review previously taught information. Students might retrieve previously taught information from something to do with spelling, from something to do with vocabulary. It might be where they're reading word level words. It might be where they're spelling. It might be where they're activating something to do with the text from a previous day. It might have something to do with the author's craft. Here we can see an example where students were working with a partner in this classroom, and they were using the sentence expansion because, but, so, and they had already been explicitly taught the word surreal, and they were now practicing how to use this word surreal, and the teachers were checking for understanding about how well that word was used in context and how well the students were able to retrieve that word. Another example here was a word sort. The students had a bunch of prefixes and base and root words, and they had to match them with a partner. The purpose of the retrieval practice is for you to check how well the students have retained the information so that you can check for gaps in learning, and it informs your next steps for instruction. Retrieval practice might include things like a true or false routine, example, non-examples, a close, a quiz. Check for understandings are evident in a retrieval practice, just as they are in the restructure of this literacy block. A pair share and calling on volunteers and non-volunteers where necessary. So when we draw on the curriculum and the evidence and all of the frameworks, we're helping students to use and to understand text structures and language features. What you'll see in both sides of this are evidence from the frameworks I introduced you to, plus other researched frameworks. And what we're doing here is we're engaging students in reading and writing with a focus on a particular language feature or text structure. How can they understand these and how they've been used in texts, as well as how can they use them themselves when they're writing? And here we see the quality texts, background knowledge, fluency practice, vocab word choices, writing process, author's craft, language features, text structures, grammar and syntax, spelling and punctuation, handwriting and typing, reading, writing, and retrieval practice. These elements are all fundamental to the all of these elements here are the fundamental elements of a literacy block in years 3 to 6. Now, of course, we're not covering or uncovering each of these in absolutely every lesson, but these form the basis of what we're doing when we're restructuring the literacy block. It's at this point that teachers and leaders often ask, but that's great, we've got all of this information. How does this actually look? What does this look like across the course of a week? So I've mapped this out for you, and this is a suggested literacy block outline if we've got 120 minutes. So we've got the beginning of our literacy block starting with a retrieval practice, about 10 minutes. Then we move into the explicit teaching of spelling or morphology. And the LA and the LY is relating to the curriculum codes from the English curriculum. LA is relating to language and LY is relating to the literacy strand. And this would be happening each day, about 15 minutes. Fluency practice, as well as accountable independent reading, would be taking place over the course of the week. Remember, I mentioned that before, the AIR, based on the work from Lamont, we would be asking text-dependent questions, or we'd be asking questions from questioning the author. But the purpose of this independent reading time is to transfer the skills that have been taught and knowledge, and that there's reading for a particular purpose and a focus. We saw with some earlier examples of what fluency practice looks like, whether that's as a whole class or whether that's as pairs. 40 minutes around reading, and we've got LE for literature, LA for language, and LY for literacy. This is where all of those 3 strands from the English curriculum are embodied, as well as where we start to use those reading routines. You can see why that mentor text is fundamental to the literacy block, because so much work is done with it from a reading and a writing perspective. This is where students read that quality text with the teacher. This is where we use the choral, shared, echo reading routines. This is where we explicitly teach the vocabulary. This is where we pause. We have pause points during the reading of the text so that we can ask questions, draw on comprehension strategies, and make meaning of the texts. We then include that use of grammar, We then include that use of grammar. So the LA is referring to the language and the LY is referring to the literacy. This is where we're teaching students those word level, sentence level writing skills, the types of sentences, the sentence structure. This is where, as we're reading that quality mentor text, we start to see how the author has included those and what impact that has on us as readers. Why have those types of words, the precise, sophisticated words being used? Why have those types of sentences being used for us? We might even extract a piece of text and then we start to unpack and analyze that so that students have the opportunity to practice writing that in the same way. And then we have 30 minutes of writing time as well. So the LE is relating to the literature, LA language, and LY literacy. This is where we're interpreting and critically thinking about the mentor text from a writer's perspective, the language features that have been used, the text structure, and those authorial choices and devices. This is where we're not only analyzing the text from perhaps a paragraph and text level, but where students are given that opportunity to write after perhaps seeing an annotation, a close unpacking of a text, or a deconstruction. So if the backbone and basis of our literacy block is centered around quality literature or mentor text, we also need to ensure that there are opportunities to read and interpret nonfiction texts. So this is where we start to then consider, well, perhaps we have a 3 or a 2-day split or a 4 and a 1-day split. What that means is we allow for the teaching of different types of text types, whether that's through reading or through writing, but it also provides the teachers a chance to model text relating to genre, maybe the writing process, as well as giving students the opportunity to practice genre-based writing, as well as word, text, and sentence level writing. So to review our session, we're a group of teachers. We're at the beginning of their restructuring their literacy block in 2024. And now in term 3 of 2025, I showed you their after, the before and after, how they've reconstructed and continuing to reconstruct their literacy block for that depth and rigor of language comprehension and writing craft. We looked at the big 5 or the big 6, as well as the reading rope and the writing rope. And then we analysed some of those similarities to help us form the fundamental elements of the literacy block from a theoretical point of view. And then what we did, we started to see what they looked like in practice, whether they were through the Novastar examples or some of the classroom examples that I've shared with you. And then we finished with a suggested literacy block outline in years 3 to 6. Just before we end, and we have some time for some questions, I wanted to bring our webinar to a close to come back to the purpose. So remember, whenever we're going through this transformational change and this process of change, yes, there are challenges, but this is what we're also striving for. These are the opportunities. Remember those moments of magic I spoke about earlier on. So just like the teachers I introduced you to earlier on in the webinar, this is your goal. That collective clarity, that direction that is your collective clarity around the direction and the approaches so that you can ensure consistency and coherence around your literacy block in years 3 to 6. There's that opportunity for you now to embed the next best literacy steps for you so that you're clear on, well, what happens next based on what I've introduced you to from this webinar. And finally, you're now thinking about how do we see that alignment between reading and writing together so that there's that explicit teaching of the literacy, literature, and language skills through quality mentor texts so that it enables you to effectively restructure your literacy block for high quality instruction and effective literacy practices. There is an opportunity for you to ask questions. If you can't think of your question at the moment, please reach out to me after the webinar. Perhaps something might just need to settle and you might need to sit with it for a bit. Or if you are in need of having your literacy block restructured and you're not sure where to start, I'm more than happy for you to continue this conversation with me if you send me an email. I just wanted to say a really big thank you for everybody for joining me today. It's through this collaboration and through supporting each other and sharing knowledge that we can continue to make a difference to what we're doing in our literacy blocks with our students, so that it's grounded in evidence, informed by practice, and inspired by research. I wish you all the best as you continue to restructure your literacy block after decodables.